Thank you very much, Steve. I'm a PC user, and this is a Mac, so I'm hopelessly lost in changing these myself. So we've heard from Sasha about the vulnerability that we're facing over the course of the next several decades. And we heard from Jeff that our waterfronts are really important to us economically, and we really want to make the best of those for our community's sake. And I'm going to talk about kind of the intersection of those two places, or those two ideas, and some options for how we might think moving forward over the long term for trying to balance those two pieces. So we're seeing more and more development along our shorelines because the Hudson River is cleaner now than it's been in a very long time. We're also seeing some very, very destructive events that are occurring that are costing our communities, our state, our nation a lot of money. And so we have to think about whether we can do this in a more maybe sensible long-term strategy. This is the area in which we are sitting during Tropical Storm Lee. And as you can see, it's flooded. This has become, in the last couple of decades, more and more of a regular occurrence in this area. So it's creating a real challenge for Kingston. But the question for us here today is, can we do this smarter? Can we do this redevelopment, this waterfront revitalization in our communities along the Hudson River smarter? Can we look at where we expect the vulnerability to be now and into the future? And then can we balance three really important things: the economic benefits of our waterfronts, the environmental benefits of our estuary, and it's become cleaner and that's attracting people to the shoreline. Can we make sure we continue to keep our natural assets working and functioning for the entire system so that that water stays clean and continues to draw people to the waterfront? And can we do it in a safe way so that we're not creating really large long-term costs over the next several decades? So we have a lot of planners in the room, and a lot of you are very familiar with thinking about waterfront planning or thinking about planning on a regional scale. And there are many important questions that we have to think about. But I think there are some new questions we have to start inserting into this process. First, as I mentioned before, where are the areas of vulnerability now? Where are those places going to be 20, 30, 50, 80 years from now as we consider infrastructure, building infrastructure that has lifespans on that scale? What is the lifespan of the infrastructure we have in place? Is it something that we need to think about engineering to adapt to flooding, or is it something that's nearing the end of its useful life? And perhaps it could be moved to another location where it won't be as vulnerable. And then what are the natural assets? What are the most important things for the system Melanie? For the system as a whole?
Let's start over. Not you.
The whole presentation? Try and talk really loud. So where are the natural assets that we need to conserve in the Hudson Valley? The places that Sasha mentioned we need to keep functioning in order to keep this clean water that we have out here in front of us. There are considerations at the site level. Do we have the funding to undertake projects that we're thinking about? Do we have the technical expertise to adapt a sewage treatment plant? Do we have the environmental knowledge for creating a shoreline that can not only protect areas that need protection, but create some environmental benefits? Do we have the political will to make these happen, given that these are really long-term decisions that we have to be thinking about? And sometimes, due to term limits, we don't always think in that frame. Are there decisions that we're making going to benefit us socially? Are they going to protect the vulnerable populations that might be at greater risk right now through the long term?
We have Plan B here, so just hang on 1 second.
Did you blow out your hand? Oh. Hello? Hello? Oh, it's because that microphone is on, maybe?
Mine's off. Yeah, I don't know if that's doing it.
Hello? Hello? Testing. 1, 2. Hello? 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 Oh. All right. Okay, so I'll keep going here. So there are 3 options, really, for us along our waterfronts. We can choose to protect, which in the Hudson typically means armoring the shoreline. Out in Long Island, they may do things like beach nourishment to keep the beaches viable there. But here it's pretty much armoring the shoreline. Accommodation, which means designing places to flood, either elevating structures or elevating land, or simply designing roadways so that they can survive, sustain a flood event. Similar to what Steve was mentioning has been done here in the Steel House. And the third is strategic relocation. So where we have structures that are in harm's way now, can they be moved? Or can we change our land use practices so that we're not increasing the burden on our communities in terms of long-term costs of protecting development that we're putting in high hazard areas? I'm going to share examples of each of these 3. So the first is armoring. Now we do armoring for very good reason in the Hudson. We have transportation infrastructure, energy infrastructure that we need to ensure continues to run and is safe and keeps our communities moving. We have cultural landmarks that we want to protect, and we have high property values that we need to protect. So we do this for very good reason. But can we do it better? Typically we see things like sheet pile and very straight, hard shorelines. I'm part of a project called the Sustainable Shorelines Project. It's being led by Betsy Blair at the Hudson River National Estuarine Research Reserve. There are a lot of people are participating in that project that are in this room today. And we're trying to come up with ways and guidance that we can give people who are needing to protect their shoreline, but are interested in doing it in a more environmentally friendly way. So these are some of the principles that we've come up with in this project. Try to, if you're going to have to create structural solutions, are there ways to create nooks and crannies in those, armored shorelines that can allow for biological debris? You might be able to do that with a concrete form that allows, the creation of those kinds of areas for natural habitat. Try not to keep it really, really clean, which may be hard in some locations, but that biological debris actually is what sustains a lot of life in the Hudson Estuary. Try not to make it so hard. If you don't need deep water access, and you don't have to have that a steel bulkhead, are there ways that you can soften the shoreline but still reduce erosion along the shoreline? Reducing wave damage. A lot of the very hard solutions actually create scour in front that eventually can lead to failure of the structure. If we can come up with new designs that might be able to reduce that wave energy or absorb that wave energy, we might be able to reduce that failure. This is an example of a site that Scenic Hudson has done, the Sopus Meadows Preserve. It used to have the seawall on the left, and now it has something called a brush mattress, which is kind of a strange term, but it actually has structural components on the right there, and then you can see that there's shrubbery that's been integrated into the structure. So it has the capacity to withstand erosion. It actually did quite well in Tropical Storm Irene, but it's also providing some ecological benefits. And it's not an area where you have to have something like deep water access. Now this is an idea that I just came across recently. And I think we have to think more about these kind of innovative design ideas and get our design community really excited about this. These are gabions, which are basically wire mesh filled with rubble. And this comes from a plan that MIT students in their architecture and planning school did for the Bronx waterfront. You can find this online at that link. It's an amazing plan. It has a lot of really great forward-thinking ideas for highly urbanized waterfronts. And you can see that this not only has vegetation and creates some nooks and crannies that provide the biological value, but it also allows people to walk down to the water and explore the water, which you might not get with a steel bulkhead or a seawall. So these are the kinds of things that I hope we can investigate. This may not work in areas where we have a lot of ice scour, but perhaps in areas further south where ice is not as much of a threat, something like this could be constructed. The next strategy is accommodation, or designing to flood. So this means either elevating your systems or providing the structural integrity to them so that they can flood safely. The first picture here in the upper left is from Hamburg, Germany. And let me see if this pointer will work for me. All right. So these are the buildings here. In this first floor, they've elevated all of the systems and important areas up above this first floor. And then there are floodgates on at the base of these buildings that can be sealed off in the event of a flood. And this road is designed to flood, so they can accommodate that flooding without having to create a really high seawall. The second picture is from Brooklyn Bridge Park, where they're designing this park to flood. And they have this old these structural components out in the water, and they've added some vegetation here that basically are going to help to reduce storm surge and wave action along that shoreline. But the area it's understood that this area is going to be flooded. This is another project that Scenic Hudson has done, and they are definitely on the forefront of these kinds of projects. This is in Tarrytown, and here's the mixed-use development, and here's a greenway area along the edge of the development. They actually did a restoration of this stream here. I believe it's Andre Brook. So this creates space for floodwaters to go, creates some ecological benefits rather than having a steel bulkhead, and it creates foot traffic so that it can benefit the businesses here in this mixed-use development. Now, New York City is actually doing a lot to try to encourage the development of greenways along their shorelines as well. The last one is strategic relocation, keeping or moving structures out of harm's way. So if you think about the shoreline we have here in the Hudson, and you think about the shoreline that's out on Long Island in New York City, and you think about the shoreline of all the rivers flowing through New York State, and then you expand to the entire country, I think it's not out of the realm of imagination that there might be a point in time where we're not able to continue to protect all of the structures we have along the waterfront. The government simply may not be able to subsidize that kind of protection. And perhaps those greenway areas in front of our developed areas where we can accommodate some of that flooding, or if we choose the areas within our community that can absorb some of those floodwaters, that might be the smartest way to go long term, so that we're not in a situation where suddenly we can't protect what it is that we feel is very valuable in our community. In addition, in the Hudson River, as Sasha was mentioning, we have these tidal wetlands, which are going to need to migrate inland as water levels rise. They are key to the ecological functioning of our estuary, and they help to create the clean water that's drawing everyone down to the waterfront. So we have to think about where these areas are going to move over time, and whether we can allow them to move in those areas so that we can keep the system healthy. Some examples of where this has been done. Now this is obviously not an example of where this has been done. These are areas that are clearly very close to the water line. And if you can imagine 4 more feet of sea level rise is going to have a dramatic impact on these places. But in Pleasant Valley, they've actually changed their zoning law so that they're limiting uses in the 100-year floodplain to those that are minimally affected by high water. So I think that actually, I haven't read this law, but I think that actually allows you to, you can consider here whether or not you're going to be saying there's no development, or development has to be designed to accommodate flooding so that these uses are minimally affected by the high water. Another area where they're being quite progressive on this issue is the town of East Hampton. This is out on Long Island, where they've considered sea level rise and storms in their comprehensive plan. They've looked at how their wetlands are changing over time. They're prohibiting the use of structures that will block that wetland movement over time inland. And they're not allowing development in the highest hazard areas so that they're not creating a long-term economic burden for their community. The next thing I'm going to go through here are a set of simulations that I created with some software that's free. You can download from NOAA. It's called CanVis, C-A-N-V-I-S. And I'm going to use this to illustrate what the 3 options that I just talked about and some of the things that you could think about here along the Kingston waterfront. So here's the Kingston waterfront today at low tide. And the tidal range here is roughly about 3 feet. So you can see the high water line right here. You can imagine adding about another foot. If you add 4 feet of sea level rise, which is what Sasha was showing in his maps, you're pretty much at the top of this bulkhead, which is going to create some very interesting challenges for this area. This is another picture of this same area taken from a little higher up so you can see what's behind it. During Tropical Storm Irene, it flooded just about to the base. I'm not sure if that first step was covered or not, but just about to the base of these stairs. So this is the same waterfront area, and I've added 4 feet of sea level rise. And I didn't do anything else but just raise the water level, so to the top of that bulkhead. And you can see the boats are kind of buried, which is kind of silly, but but you can see what 4 feet of sea level rise could mean along the waterfront here. So the next thing I'm going to go, in the next 3 slides are going to show you some different options that you might consider here in Kingston. And I want to be very clear, I'm not advocating for any one of these options. I'm just trying to illustrate what these options might look like here along the Kingston waterfront. So this is the first option, the armored protection option, where I've placed a seawall. I've elevated the sea level rise. Again, this is at low tide. So you're still looking at the 3 more feet to get to high tide along this seawall here. And then I haven't elevated the land behind it. I'm assuming that perhaps there are stairs or something that can take people down to the land at grade as it currently is today. And you'd have to think about how long you'd actually make this wall. But it does provide for the deep water access and allows larger boats to pull up next to the Kingston waterfront as they do today. So there are pros and cons to each of these, but I'm not going to go into all of them. I think you can start to think through that yourselves. This is another option here. This is a revetment, or a riprap, kind of sloping rock shoreline. Kind of similar to what we saw at the Esopus Meadows site that I showed you that Scenic Hudson did. It's got vegetation interspersed in between the rocks, providing some ecological benefit. Again, I haven't raised the elevation of the land behind it. It doesn't provide for that deep water access because this is a sloped shoreline. So perhaps boats would have to moor out further into the channel, but they could take smaller boats perhaps, or swim, I don't know, over to these docks, and they could still access the waterfront. Now, in this picture, I'm doing something, I'm actually assuming that this area is being designed to flood, similar to the wave attenuation project that was in Brooklyn Bridge Park. So the water would overtop these banks regularly, and the first floor of these historic buildings has been walled off, similar to what you saw in the Hamburg, Germany site, where they secured the first floor of these buildings. So you can still use the space up top. The historic buildings are still there, but they're protected from the flood events that are affecting the area. And this is the last one. This is much more dramatic and maybe a bit shocking, but it illustrates the third option. And so I did my best to try to create what that might look like in the same area. So if we imagine that there might be a scenario where there's so much damage along the waterfront, or there's just not enough funding to sustain the waterfront, it's allowed to turn back into a natural floodplain. We've got park areas, maybe some wetland restoration that happens here, and provides some access to the area. These aren't perfect. I'm not an engineer at all. I'm certainly open. All of these are open to discussion. I'm just using them for illustrative purposes to help kind of wrap your mind around this challenge. So, any questions? Yes, in the back.
You mentioned the NOAA software. Could you give the name again?
Yes, it's.
And also, who are like the people that are really the early users of that in this region?
That software?
Yeah.
I don't know of anyone other than myself. But it's CANVIS, and you can just search for it on the NOAA website. It comes right up, and you can download it for free. Or they can send you a CD.
And will you develop data that you'll feed in specifically like the Canvas system?
It's actually a very, very simple software. It's just a graphic software. So it gives you the tools to kind of play around with some different options along the waterfront. and you know, it provides you bushes, you know, that you can stick in. It's very, very simplistic. But I think it's a useful tool for thinking through some of these. Yes?
I saw a term, resist tidiness.
Yes.
Well, designing the waterfront. Can you elaborate on that? Sounds interesting.
Sure, yes, I'll repeat the question. I'm sorry, I didn't do that before. He's asking what it means to resist tidiness along the shoreline. So the Sustainable Shorelines Project is a composite project of a lot of different organizations that are working together, and one of them is Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies. And they're studying how different shoreline treatments affect the biota in the river. And one of the things they're finding is that places that collect biological material, debris, seagrass, logs, etc., are actually much more conducive to plant and animal life, especially fish life, than areas where you've just got a very straight line, or places that are cleaned up very, very clean. And while that may be appealing to us, it's not as appealing to the plants and animals who need those little nooks and crannies to hide.
Thank you.
Yep. Any other questions? Yes?
What's the state DEC or whatever doing to stop that mud flow coming down these shores?
The question was, what is the state DEC doing to stop the mud flow coming down the Esopus? I know exactly what you're talking about, but I'm not actually familiar with the response. I don't know if anyone else here wants to comment on that quickly. No?
I'll be happy to address it later.
Okay, Dennis is going to address it later when he talks. Yes?
Any developments of like statewide or regional plans over the last few months that the group can tell of in terms of like working groups or task forces and what's been worked on?
In terms of this issue? Yes. The first thing that comes to mind is that Scenic Hudson is hoping to work with some partners to create sea level rise task forces in individual communities. And I think Sasha's going to be leading that effort. I'm sure we'll all be kind of working together as a team on that. But trying to get community members interested in thinking about this for their own waterfront. On a larger scale, there's the Sea Level Rise Task Force report, which you may or may not be aware of, that looked at sea level rise impacts for all of the Hudson River estuary, New York City, and Long Island, and came up with some recommendations to respond. There are several state agencies that are trying to think about how to move those recommendations forward in concert with New York City. So that effort is still moving forward. And the climate report, thank you, Emily. If you're not aware of it already, New York State did a statewide impacts assessment on all aspects of climate change on the entire state, and it's a 600-page report, so it's very, very, there's a lot of information packed into it, but you can find that if you search for that on the web. It's on NYSERDA's website, NYSERDA, New York State Energy and Research and Development Authority. Yes?
This might be an opportune moment to mention that a week from tomorrow, in Millbrook, at the Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies, Dr. Orrin Pilkey will be presenting, and the tie-in to the presentations we've had so far is that going back 40 years ago, Dr. Pilkey started talking along the barrier islands and the ocean front about the fact that armoring doesn't work. So he's now looking at the global picture of global warming, but he comes to that talk a week from tomorrow night at the Cary Institute with the background of discussing even issues like the fact that armoring doesn't work. And it's a public presentation like many they've had that many of us have attended. It's a big auditorium, so I think there'll be room for everybody to go if they can work it in.
Okay, so just to repeat that, Orrin Pilkey will be speaking on, sounds like the disadvantages of armoring the shoreline. He's been doing work, sounds like all over the world, and he'll be speaking at Cary Institute of Ecosystem Studies a week from tomorrow. Yes?
The galleons, is that what you call them?
Gabions.
Gabions, I can't read my own writing here. Is that just a theoretical thing so far, or have there been examples of its being used?
Gabions are used now along lower energy environments along streams. They're not typically
Yeah.
used up here in the Hudson estuary because of the ice scour can actually destroy the wire mesh, and once you release the rubble or the rocks onto the shoreline, it's really hard to get them back. But in areas where there may not be as much of an ice threat, say down further south, like in New York City, it may be a possibility, or there may be some other way to create the same kind of structure, maybe with, you know, concrete or steel, where you'd still get the same variability and diversity in the structure and the access, but you wouldn't be doing it with gabions. Anything else? Anyone upstairs? All right.